Why was everyone ignoring her at the briefing table? Chief Warrant Officer Lily Phoenix Anderson sat in the back corner of the sterile briefing room, watching 32 men discuss why her mission was impossible. Her blonde hair was pulled back in the regulation bun that had become second nature after 8 years of military discipline. Blue eyes that could track multiple targets simultaneously now tracked something else entirely. The subtle dismissals, the avoided glances, the way conversations stopped when she walked by. She'd been studying satellite imagery of that compound for 3 weeks. 3 weeks of sleepless nights, endless calculations, terrain analysis software running until her laptop overheated. While they declared it unreachable, she was mapping flight paths through impossible spaces. But sitting here now, listening to SEAL Commander Jake Thompson explain why no Apache could survive the approach, she wondered if expertise mattered when wrapped in a 5'7" frame with a voice that didn't boom across briefing rooms. The compound glowed on the massive screen, a fortress carved into the Tora Bora Mountains like a cancerous growth. Anti-aircraft systems dotted the perimeter. Russian SA-18 shoulder-fired missiles, Chinese HQ-7 short-range defense systems, the kind of hardware that turned helicopters into falling metal coffins. The terrain makes helicopter operations impossible, Commander Thompson continued, his weathered face grim under harsh fluorescent lights. No Apache can hit that target and survive. Phoenix felt something twist in her chest. Not anger. She'd learned to channel that into fuel years ago. This was deeper, the quiet ache of being invisible in plain sight, of having answers that no one wanted to hear from someone who looked like her. She thought about her father's words from childhood. Lily, sometimes the world needs to see what you can do before they'll hear what you have to say. At 27, with over 2,400 combat flight hours across Afghanistan, Syria, and classified locations that existed only in heavily redacted reports, she was still waiting for the world to see. Major Sarah Viper Cole stepped forward, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd earned her call sign the hard way. The altitude will seriously degrade aircraft performance. The terrain favors defenders. We're looking at 60% casualties for any ground assault. Phoenix's mind wandered to the 3 faces in the intelligence photos. General Khalid al-Rashid, responsible for coordinating attacks that had killed over 200 coalition forces. General Omar Hassan, chief of operations for a weapons trafficking network that armed terrorists across 3 countries. General Yasir Mimud, the financial coordinator whose money laundering operations funded the nightmare that kept her awake at night. She'd memorized their faces not from professional duty, but from something more personal. Every mission she'd flown, every target she'd eliminated, every Hellfire missile she'd guided to its mark, it all traced back to networks like theirs. The faces of fallen soldiers she'd carried home haunted her dreams. And now, 3 of the architects of that suffering would be in the same room for 4 hours. 4 hours that might not come again for years. Ground assault is our only option, Thompson concluded. High risk but manageable. The word manageable hung in the air like smoke from a burning aircraft. Phoenix knew the math behind that euphemism. 60% casualties meant 18 soldiers might not come home from a 30-person operation. 18 families destroyed because everyone agreed that helicopter operations were impossible. But what they didn't know, what none of them had considered, was that impossible and undiscovered weren't the same thing. While they saw obstacles, she saw opportunities. While they calculated why it couldn't be done, she'd been calculating how it could. The canyon system on the northwestern side of the valley, barely visible in satellite imagery, dismissed by intelligence analysts as too confined for aircraft operations. 15 kilometers of natural tunnel carved through solid rock by millennia of geological forces. Walls rising 800 feet on both sides. Multiple tight turns that would require precision flying at the absolute edge of human capability. It was insane. It was suicidal. It was exactly the kind of approach that no rational defense would expect. Phoenix's hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the adrenaline of possibility. She could see the flight path in her mind, could feel the Apache's response to control inputs in confined space, could calculate the split-second timing required to navigate through terrain that existed in the gray area between possible and impossible. But first, she had to find her voice in a room full of men who'd already decided what helicopters couldn't do. "Sir," she said, standing from her position in the back corner. The briefing room fell silent. 32 heads turned toward the young woman who just interrupted a mission planning session to volunteer for something everyone knew was impossible. Commander Thompson's eyes met hers across the room. In that moment, she saw something unexpected, not dismissal but curiosity. The look of someone who'd learned to recognize when experience was speaking, regardless of the voice carrying it. "I'd like to volunteer for the air support mission." The silence stretched like a held breath. In that pause, Phoenix felt the weight of every flight hour she'd accumulated, every impossible landing she'd made, every target she'd eliminated when the odds said she should have failed. Her call sign hadn't come from surviving one impossible situation. It had come from consistently rising from scenarios that should have destroyed her aircraft and ended her career. She thought about the first time someone had called her Phoenix. A night flight in Afghanistan, mechanical failure at 8,000 feet, auto-rotation landing in a space barely larger than her rotor disc. She'd walked away from wreckage that should have killed her and somehow made it home to base. The next morning, Chief Warrant Officer Marcus Rivera had painted a small phoenix on her aircraft's nose. "Some people survive crashes," he'd said. "You rise from them." Now, standing in this briefing room, Phoenix realized that her entire career had been preparation for this moment. Not just the flying skills or combat experience, but the quiet strength required to stand up when everyone else was sitting down, to offer solutions when everyone else was explaining problems, to volunteer for missions that existed at the intersection of necessary and impossible. "Chief Anderson," Commander Thompson said carefully, "we've just spent 30 minutes explaining why helicopter operations against this target are not feasible." Phoenix felt her heart rate settle into the rhythm she'd learned to recognize before difficult flights. The physiological response of someone who'd trained their body to be calm when stakes were highest. Her voice, when it came, carried 8 years of combat experience compressed into simple words. "Yes, sir, I understand the challenges, but I believe there's an approach route that hasn't been considered." Major Cole stepped forward, her expression mixing professional respect with maternal concern. Phoenix had always appreciated Cole's direct communication style. No condescension, no softened words, just soldier-to-soldier honesty. "Chief, I've reviewed every possible approach to that compound. The terrain makes Apache operations suicidal." The word suicidal hit Phoenix like a physical blow. Not because it was inaccurate. The mission would push both aircraft and pilot beyond normal operational parameters, but because it reduced her years of specialized training to recklessness. As if her willingness to attempt the impossible came from desperation rather than expertise. She thought about the countless hours she'd spent in flight simulators, practicing confined space operations until muscle memory replaced conscious thought. The advanced courses in terrain masking, precision navigation, emergency procedures that most pilots never bothered to master. The unofficial record she held for most confirmed kills with fewest missiles expended, not because she was trigger-happy, but because she understood that in combat, every shot had to count. "Ma'am, with respect, I think there's an option we haven't explored." Thompson studied her face with the intensity of someone trying to determine whether he was looking at expertise or overconfidence. In the military, that distinction often meant the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. Phoenix had seen overconfident pilots make decisions that killed not just themselves, but the soldiers depending on them for support. "Chief Anderson, explain what you're thinking." Phoenix moved to the front of the briefing room, acutely aware that 32 pairs of eyes were evaluating not just her words, but her right to speak them. She pointed to the satellite imagery displayed on the massive screen, her hand steady despite the magnitude of what she was proposing. "Sir, all of our planning has focused on these two main approach corridors, both of which are heavily defended and provide limited tactical options." She used the laser pointer to trace a route that existed more in topographical data than visual imagery. The canyon system was barely visible in satellite photos, just shadows and geological formations that intelligence analysts had dismissed as irrelevant to aircraft operations. But there's a third approach here, through this canyon system on the northwestern side of the valley. The canyon isn't wide enough for conventional aircraft operations, but an Apache can navigate through it with precision flying. Colonel Marcus Steele, Williams leaned forward from his position at the head table. Phoenix had heard stories about Williams, a veteran of 3 deployments who'd earned his call sign by making decisions that saved lives when softer commanders might have hesitated. His question came with the weight of someone who understood both the potential and the cost of high-risk operations. "Chief, that canyon looks barely wide enough for a helicopter. What's your margin for error?" The numbers came automatically, not from confidence, but from weeks of meticulous calculation. "Approximately 12 feet on each side, sir. It's tight, but manageable for an experienced pilot." Williams' follow-up question cut to the heart of military decision-making. "And if you encounter wind shear or mechanical problems while you're in the canyon?" Phoenix met his gaze directly. In the military, honesty about risks wasn't pessimism, it was professionalism. "Then I crash, sir. But if I make it through, I'll have a clear shot at the compound from a position where they won't expect air attack." The briefing room remained silent, but Phoenix could sense the shift in atmosphere. These weren't men dismissing a young woman's overconfidence anymore. These were experienced warriors evaluating a tactical proposal that could change the entire nature of the mission. Thompson's voice, when it came, carried new weight. "Chief Anderson, walk us through your proposed attack profile." Phoenix had been preparing for this conversation for 3 weeks, but she realized now that she'd been preparing for it her entire career. Every difficult landing, every impossible approach, every target eliminated under conditions that other pilots avoided. It had all been training for this moment when she would have to prove that the impossible was just another word for undiscovered. She connected her tablet to the briefing room display system, pulling up terrain maps that she'd studied until they were imprinted in her memory. The route she traced with her finger represented not just a flight path, but a fundamental challenge to conventional thinking about aircraft limitations. "The approach begins here, approximately 40 kilometers from the target. I'll fly nap of the Earth to this ridgeline, using natural terrain masking to avoid detection by early warning systems." Her finger moved across the map like a pilot's hand on control surfaces, precise, deliberate, calculated. "From there, I'll transition into this canyon system, navigating through approximately 15 kilometers of confined terrain. The canyon walls will provide complete concealment from both radar and visual detection." Major Cole's question came with the sharpness of someone who'd lost aircraft to air defenses before. "What about the air defense systems?" Phoenix had run these calculations dozens of times, modeling engagement envelopes and missile performance parameters, until she understood the defensive network better than the people who'd installed it. The SA-18s are shoulder-fired systems with limited range and effectiveness against targets moving at high speed through confined spaces. The HQ-7 system is positioned to cover the main approach corridors, but it can't engage targets emerging from this canyon due to terrain masking. Thompson studied the proposed route with the intensity of someone evaluating not just tactics, but lives. "Chief, what's your confidence level for navigating through that canyon?" The question demanded honesty, not bravado. Phoenix thought about her training record, her flight hours in similar terrain, the computer simulations she'd run to model this specific approach. But more than that, she thought about the soldiers who would die in a ground assault if her mission failed. "Hi, sir. I've been practicing confined space flying in similar terrain, and I've run computer simulations of this specific route multiple times." She clicked to the next slide, showing the target building where 3 terrorist leaders would be meeting. "Once I'm in position to attack, I'll have clear lines of sight to the primary building where the targets will be meeting. 3 Hellfire missiles fired in sequence will eliminate all 3 targets simultaneously." Colonel Williams' expression had shifted from skepticism to calculation. He was no longer evaluating whether the mission was possible, but whether the potential rewards justified the enormous risks. "Chief Anderson, this is extremely high-risk flying. If something goes wrong, we won't be able to mount a rescue operation." Phoenix felt something settle in her chest, not peace, but acceptance. She thought about the faces of soldiers she'd carried home, about families destroyed by networks that these 3 men had built and funded, about the attacks that intelligence analysts said would happen if these leaders escaped to continue their operations. "Sir, I understand the risks, but this may be our only opportunity to eliminate all 3 targets in a single operation." The briefing room fell quiet again, but this time the silence carried different weight. These weren't men trying to dismiss an impossible proposal anymore. These were commanders weighing the potential to prevent future casualties against the certain risk of losing an experienced pilot and sophisticated aircraft. Phoenix realized that she'd crossed some invisible threshold. The conversation had moved from whether she could attempt the mission to whether she should be allowed to try. In the military, that transition often marked the difference between being heard and being listened to. But standing there, waiting for Thompson's decision, she also realized something else. The mission she was proposing wasn't just about tactical innovation or aircraft capabilities. It was about the willingness to attempt solutions when conventional wisdom offered only problems. It was about the kind of thinking required when 18 soldiers' lives hung in the balance, and someone had to find an alternative to acceptable casualties. Thompson made his decision with the authority of someone who'd learned to recognize when expertise was speaking, regardless of the voice carrying it. "Chief Anderson, you have authorization to attempt the mission." But his next words carried the weight of command responsibility. "However, I want detailed contingency plans for abort scenarios, and I want constant communication throughout the approach." Phoenix felt something unlock in her chest, not relief but purpose. "Yes, sir." Thompson's expression grew serious, carrying the burden of someone who'd sent too many people into situations from which they didn't return. "And Chief, if this doesn't work, if you can't make it through that canyon, or if the defenses are stronger than anticipated, I want you to abort immediately. These targets aren't worth losing an Apache and an experienced pilot." "Understood, sir." As the briefing room began to empty, Phoenix remained at the front, staring at the satellite imagery that had consumed her thoughts for 3 weeks. But now, instead of looking at an impossible target, she was looking at a mission that would test everything she'd learned about flying helicopters in conditions that existed at the margins of human capability. She thought about her co-pilot gunner, Chief Warrant Officer Marcus Ghost, Rivera, who would be sitting in the front seat managing weapons systems while she navigated through terrain that would challenge every piloting skill she'd developed. Rivera had over 1,800 combat hours and a reputation for precision engagement at maximum range. If anyone could acquire and eliminate 3 targets in the narrow window they'd have after emerging from the canyon, it was him. But Phoenix also understood that the mission's success would depend on more than individual skills. It would require the kind of seamless coordination between pilot and gunner that came from hundreds of hours flying together, from understanding each other's capabilities and limitations so completely that communication became unnecessary. She thought about the Apache helicopter that would carry them through impossible terrain, an AH-64E equipped with advanced avionics, electronic countermeasures, and three AGM-114 Hellfire missiles. Precision-guided weapons capable of eliminating hardened targets at ranges up to 8 kilometers. Technology that could make the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. But technology alone wouldn't navigate through canyon walls separated by margins measured in feet. That would require the kind of flying that existed in the space between skill and intuition, where conscious thought gave way to muscle memory, and where split-second decisions carried life-or-death consequences. Phoenix realized that she just volunteered for something that would either validate everything she believed about aircraft capabilities or prove that some limitations existed for good reasons. Either way, she would learn whether impossible flying was the solution to impossible targets, or just another way to turn experienced pilots into statistics. Standing alone in the emptying briefing room, she wondered if confidence and capability were the same thing, or if she was about to discover the difference in the most definitive way possible. What drives someone to practice flying through spaces too narrow for helicopters? Phoenix stood in the pre-dawn darkness beside her Apache, running her hands along surfaces that would either carry her through the most challenging flight of her career or become her tomb in a canyon that no rescue team could reach. The aircraft looked different in darkness, less machine, more extension of her will. She'd been flying Apache helicopters for 8 years, but she'd never asked one to do what she was planning to attempt in 6 hours. Chief Warrant Officer Marcus "Ghost" Rivera approached carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing the expression of someone who'd spent the night reviewing targeting data instead of sleeping. His reputation for precision engagement at maximum range had been earned through missions where missing meant soldiers died. But this mission would compress target acquisition and engagement into a window measured in seconds rather than minutes. "Phoenix," he said, handing her the coffee, "I've been thinking about our timing." She wrapped her hands around the warm cup, feeling the familiar pre-mission combination of focus and nervous energy. "What's bothering you?" Rivera pulled up tactical displays on his tablet, showing the compound layout they'd memorized during planning sessions. "We'll have maybe 30 seconds from the time we emerge from that canyon until we need to be firing missiles. 30 seconds to acquire 3 separate targets, calculate engagement sequences, and eliminate all 3 before they can react or escape." Phoenix studied the targeting data, understanding the complexity of what Rivera would be managing, while she focused on keeping them alive in confined space. "Can you do it?" "I can acquire and engage 3 targets in under 20 seconds if you get me into position. The challenge isn't target acquisition. It's ensuring that all 3 targets are eliminated simultaneously." The distinction mattered more than most people realized. If one target survived the initial attack, he would disappear before they could re-engage. Intelligence indicated that the 3 terrorist leaders traveled with elaborate escape plans and extensive security networks. Missing one target didn't just mean mission failure. It meant ensuring that the survivor would be even more difficult to locate and eliminate in future operations. "What's the spacing between targets?" Phoenix asked. Rivera zoomed in on building layouts that intelligence had developed through months of surveillance. "Approximately 200 meters. The primary building is here, with 2 secondary structures positioned to provide overlapping fields of fire for defensive positions." Phoenix calculated missile flight times in her head, the kind of mental math that combat pilots learn to perform instinctively. Time of flight for Hellfire missiles at this range: approximately 8 seconds. If I fire all 3 missiles within a 4-second window, they'll impact nearly simultaneously. Phoenix nodded, understanding the precision required, but she also understood that their margin for error was essentially non-existent. "That's the plan, but we only get one shot at this. If we miss, or if the targets aren't where intelligence says they'll be, the mission fails." Rivera's expression grew serious in the way that came from understanding stakes beyond mission parameters. And if we don't take the shot, 18 ground assault personnel risk becoming casualties in an operation that intelligence estimates has a 40% failure rate. The weight of that calculation settled between them. Phoenix had spent her career making decisions that affected mission outcomes, but this was different. This time, the alternative to her success wasn't just failure. It was watching other soldiers attempt something equally dangerous through different means. She thought about the ground assault team that was preparing alternate plans. 18 soldiers who would have to approach the compound through terrain that favored defenders, against enemies who knew they were coming, with casualty projections that made survival feel like chance rather than strategy. Good soldiers whose families would receive folded flags if her mission failed. Ghost, we're not just trying to eliminate 3 targets. We're trying to prevent a ground assault that could kill 18 people. Rivera met her gaze with the directness that came from years of combat operations. Then, we better not miss. Phoenix finished her coffee and began her pre-flight inspection with methodical care that had become ritual over thousands of flight hours. She checked every system, every weapon, every component that could affect mission success or aircraft survival. But more than that, she was preparing mentally for flying that would require intuition and muscle memory to replace conscious thought. The Apache A-64E they would be flying represented the peak of attack helicopter technology. Advanced avionics, sophisticated targeting systems, electronic countermeasures, communication equipment that could maintain contact with command centers across hundreds of miles. But all of that technology would be useless if she couldn't navigate through terrain that existed at the margins of aircraft performance capabilities. She thought about the canyon system they would enter in 4 hours. 15 kilometers of natural tunnel carved through solid rock, with walls rising 800 feet on both sides and multiple tight turns that would require precision flying at speeds that left no room for error. The kind of terrain that helicopter flight manuals classified as unsuitable for aircraft operations. But Phoenix had learned something during her years of combat flying that wasn't taught in flight manuals. Aircraft capabilities were often limited more by pilot imagination than engineering constraints. The Apache could physically fit through spaces that seemed impossibly narrow. It could maneuver through turns that appeared to violate basic principles of helicopter flight. It could operate in conditions that conventional wisdom declared unsafe. The question wasn't whether the aircraft could handle the mission. It was whether she could handle the aircraft under conditions that would test every skill she'd developed, and several that she was still discovering. "Phoenix, you ready for this?" Rivera asked as they completed their systems checks. She looked at the satellite imagery displayed on her planning tablet, seeing not just terrain features, but the flight path she'd visualized hundreds of times during preparation. "I've been ready for 3 weeks." But saying it out loud, she realized that readiness wasn't the same as certainty. No amount of preparation could eliminate the unknown variables that would emerge during actual flight operations. Wind patterns in the canyon could shift without warning. Mechanical systems could fail at moments when backup procedures weren't available. Enemy defensive measures could include capabilities that intelligence hadn't detected or understood. The mission would succeed or fail based on her ability to adapt to circumstances that no simulation could perfectly replicate. That was both the challenge and the appeal of flying at the edge of possible. Success required more than technical skill. It required the kind of thinking that could solve problems faster than they developed. Phoenix strapped herself into the pilot's seat, feeling the familiar sensation of becoming part of something larger than herself. The Apache's controls responded to her inputs with mechanical precision, but she knew that successful completion of this mission would require her to push the aircraft beyond normal operational parameters. She would be asking it to fly through spaces and perform maneuvers that existed in the gray area between designed capabilities and absolute limits. Ghost systems check. Rivera's voice came through the intercom with professional calm. Target acquisition system active. Hellfire missiles armed and ready. Communication systems functioning normally. Phoenix initiated engine startup procedures, listening to the familiar sounds of turbine engines coming online and rotor systems beginning their rotation. But this morning, those sounds carried different meaning. They weren't just preparing for another combat mission. They were preparing to attempt something that had never been done before. The flight to the target area would take 90 minutes, following a route that used every terrain masking technique Phoenix had learned during her combat career. She would stay below ridgelines, use natural features to avoid radar detection, and employ electronic countermeasures to minimize their signature against air defense systems. But all of that was preliminary. The real mission would begin when they reached the canyon entrance, the point where conventional helicopter tactics ended and something else entirely began. Phoenix lifted off into pre-dawn darkness, immediately transitioning to low-level flight that would keep them invisible to enemy surveillance systems. The Apache responded to her control inputs with the precision that came from thousands of hours of maintenance and engineering refinement. But she also felt something else, the aircraft's eagerness to be tested, to discover what it could accomplish when conventional limitations were set aside. Flying toward terrain that no rational person would attempt to navigate by helicopter, Phoenix realized that she wasn't just risking her career or her life. She was risking the fundamental assumptions about what was possible for military aviation. If she succeeded, it would prove that aircraft capabilities were broader than most people understood. If she failed, it would confirm that some limitations existed for good reasons. But sitting in the pilot's seat of an aircraft that had been designed for exactly this kind of mission, Phoenix felt something that went beyond confidence or uncertainty. She felt purpose, the kind of clarity that came from understanding that some risks were worth taking not because success was guaranteed, but because the alternative was unacceptable. Rivera's voice came through the intercom as they approached the first navigation waypoint. Phoenix, intelligence reports suggest that weather conditions in the target area are marginal but acceptable. Phoenix checked her weather radar, seeing the atmospheric conditions that would affect their approach. Acceptable, in military aviation, meant survivable rather than optimal. It meant that the mission could proceed, but that additional variables would need to be managed during flight operations that were already at the edge of human capability. Copy that, Ghost. Weather is one more thing we'll deal with when we get there. She thought about the terrorist leaders who were, at that moment, preparing for a meeting that intelligence suggested would coordinate attacks against coalition forces across 3 countries. 3 men whose decisions had resulted in the deaths of soldiers, whose names Phoenix could recite from memory. 3 targets who believed they were gathering in a location too well-defended and geographically protected for air attack. In 4 hours, she would prove them wrong, or she would become another statistic in the long history of pilots who had attempted missions beyond their capabilities. Either way, Phoenix realized, she would learn something definitive about the difference between impossible and undiscovered. And that knowledge, whether it came through success or failure, would be worth the risk of finding out. The Apache flew through darkness toward terrain that would test everything she understood about helicopter flight. But Phoenix felt something she hadn't expected: excitement. Not about the danger, but about the opportunity to discover what was possible when conventional thinking was abandoned, and someone was willing to explore the space between designed capabilities and absolute limits. She was about to find out whether impossible flying was the solution to impossible targets, or whether some barriers existed because crossing them led to places from which no one returned. How do you fly a helicopter through a space barely wider than its rotor disc? Phoenix felt the Apache's response change the moment they entered the canyon. The rotor wash, normally dissipating into open air, began interacting with the confined space around them. Sound changed. No longer the familiar wop-wop of blades cutting through atmosphere, but something different, compressed, amplified by rock walls that rose 800 feet on both sides. "Ghost, we're committed now," she said into the intercom. "From this point forward, maintain radio silence unless we have an emergency." Rivera's voice came back steady, professional. "Copy, let's do this." The canyon entrance had looked impossibly narrow from satellite imagery. In reality, sitting in the cockpit of an Apache helicopter, it felt like flying into a tunnel carved from solid rock. Phoenix could see the canyon walls on both sides through her peripheral vision, not distant terrain features, but immediate, threatening surfaces that existed at the absolute edge of her rotor disk. She had 12 feet of clearance on each side. In aviation terms, that wasn't a margin, it was a prayer with mechanical precision. The first challenge came within minutes. A sharp left turn that required Phoenix to bank the aircraft nearly 45 degrees while maintaining precise altitude control. Too high, and the rotors would strike the canyon walls. Too low, and the aircraft would impact the rocky floor. The margin for error existed only in the space between perfect control and catastrophic failure. Phoenix felt muscle memory take over, thousands of hours of flight training compressed into control inputs that happened faster than conscious thought. The Apache responded to her cyclic and collective movements with mechanical precision, but she could feel the aircraft straining against conditions it hadn't been designed for. "This is insane flying," Rivera muttered over the intercom. Phoenix's voice, when it came, carried the calm that came from complete focus. "This is Tuesday morning flying." But even as she said it, Phoenix knew this was something else entirely. This was flying that existed in the space between training and intuition, where conscious decision-making gave way to something more fundamental. She wasn't just controlling the aircraft. She was becoming part of it, extending her awareness through rotor blades and control surfaces, until the helicopter became an extension of her, well, rather than a machine she was operating. The second challenge was a series of S-curves through a section of canyon, where the walls narrowed to less than 60 feet apart. Phoenix had to fly the aircraft sideways through the tightest sections, using collective and cyclic control inputs that required split-second timing and perfect coordination between her hands and feet. She thought about the computer simulations she'd run during mission planning. Digital models could calculate flight paths and performance parameters, but they couldn't replicate the sensation of rotor wash interacting with confined space, or the way turbulence created by irregular rock surfaces affected aircraft control. Reality was messier than simulation, requiring constant micro-adjustments that no computer could anticipate. But Phoenix had trained for exactly this kind of flying. Not this specific canyon, but the mental and physical processes required to operate aircraft in conditions that pushed both machine and pilot beyond normal parameters. She'd spent years practicing confined space operations, learning to trust instruments when visual references became unreliable, developing the kind of hand-eye coordination that allowed precise control when margins for error disappeared. The canyon walls seemed to press closer as they progressed deeper into the mountain. Phoenix could see individual rock formations, geological features carved by millions of years of erosion, ancient patterns that had existed long before humans learned to fly and would continue long after her aircraft had become dust. There was something humbling about navigating through terrain that measured time in epochs rather than seconds. But humility was a luxury she couldn't afford. The mission required absolute focus on immediate challenges, wind patterns that shifted without warning, turbulence created by rotor wash reflecting off canyon walls, navigation requirements that demanded precision measured in feet rather than miles. "Ghost, how are you handling the sensory overload back there?" Phoenix asked. Rivera's voice came through the intercom with professional calm. "I'm focused on target acquisition systems and missile employment procedures, But I'll admit, watching canyon walls pass by 6 feet from my position is interesting. Phoenix understood what he wasn't saying. Combat veterans learned to compartmentalize fear, to function effectively in situations that would paralyze most people. But this flight was testing psychological limits that went beyond normal combat stress. They were flying through terrain that violated basic human instincts about safe spaces and acceptable risks. She thought about the phrase "nap of the earth flying," military terminology for aircraft operations at extremely low altitude. But what they were doing wasn't nap of the earth. It was something else entirely. It was flying through the earth, using geological features not just for concealment, but as navigation boundaries that define the difference between mission success and immediate death. The canyon began to widen slightly as they progressed toward the target area. Phoenix could feel tension in her shoulders that she hadn't realized was building during the confined space navigation. But she also felt something else: exhilaration. The pure satisfaction that came from successfully completing flight operations that pushed both aircraft and pilot to their absolute limits. She checked her navigation systems, confirming their position relative to the target compound. 15 minutes of canyon navigation had brought them to within striking distance of 3 terrorist leaders who believed they were meeting in a location impossible to attack from the air. In approximately 30 seconds, Phoenix would prove them wrong. But first, she had to execute the most challenging part of the entire flight. The canyon system ended at a natural rock formation that concealed the aircraft until the last possible moment. Phoenix would have to make a 90-degree turn around the concealing rock formation, immediately acquire 3 separate targets, and engage them with Hellfire missiles before defensive systems could respond. Ghost, 30 seconds to target area. Are you ready? Rivera's voice came back with the confidence that came from 1,800 combat hours and a reputation for precision engagement. Target acquisition system is active. Hellfire missiles are armed and ready. I'm tracking 3 heat signatures in the target building. Phoenix felt her heart rate settle into the rhythm she'd learned to recognize before critical flight maneuvers. The physiological response of someone who'd trained their body to be calm when stakes were highest. But she also felt something else, the kind of focus that came from understanding that the next 30 seconds would determine whether months of planning and preparation had been worthwhile. Outstanding, here we go. Phoenix pulled the Apache around the concealing rock formation at exactly 120 knots, immediately transitioning to a hover as Rivera's targeting system locked onto enemy positions. The transition from high-speed flight to precision hover required control inputs that happened faster than conscious thought, muscle memory developed through years of combat operations where hesitation meant death. What they found was exactly what intelligence had predicted, but seeing it through the Apache's advanced sensor systems made it real in a way that satellite imagery never could. A fortified compound with 3 separate buildings, defensive positions manned by armed fighters, and 3 high-value targets whose heat signatures were clearly visible through thermal imaging systems. Phoenix realized that they had achieved something that military aviation experts had declared impossible. They had approached a heavily defended target completely undetected, emerging from concealment at a range where precision-guided weapons could be employed with maximum effectiveness. The terrorist leaders who had planned attacks that killed coalition soldiers were about to discover that geographic protection was an illusion when someone was willing to attempt flight operations that conventional wisdom considered impossible. Target acquisition complete, Rivera announced. 3 confirmed targets, 3 Hellfire missiles ready for engagement. Phoenix thought about the soldiers whose names she'd memorized, coalition forces killed by networks that these 3 men had built and funded. She thought about the ground assault team that was preparing to attempt a mission with 60% casualty projections. She thought about the attacks that intelligence analysis suggested would happen if these targets escaped to continue their operations. "Fire all missiles," she ordered. Rivera engaged the targets in rapid sequence, launching 3 Hellfire missiles within a 6-second window. Phoenix watched the missiles streak toward their targets with the precision that made them among the most effective air-to-ground weapons in the world. But she also understood that their success had been made possible by something that no weapon system could provide: the willingness to attempt flight operation that existed at the margins of human capability. The first missile impacted the primary building where General al-Rashid was conducting the meeting. Phoenix saw the explosion through her targeting systems, not just as tactical success, but as the elimination of someone responsible for the deaths of over 200 coalition forces. The second missile hit the communications building where General Hassan had been coordinating with field commanders. The structure erupted in flames as sensitive equipment and ammunition stores were detonated by the precision strike. The third missile struck the command bunker where General Mimute had been reviewing financial documents. The reinforced structure was penetrated and destroyed by a shaped charge warhead designed specifically for hardened targets. 3 hits, 3 kills, Rivera confirmed. All targets eliminated. But their celebration was premature. The sound of missile impacts had alerted every defensive position in the compound, and Phoenix could see muzzle flashes erupting from multiple locations as enemy fighters began engaging her aircraft with small arms and rocket-propelled grenades. "Ghost, we need to get out of here now." Phoenix pulled the Apache into a climbing turn, using the same terrain features that had concealed their approach to mask their escape. But the confined canyon that had provided concealment during the approach now became a potential trap. If enemy forces positioned fighters at the canyon exit, the Apache would be vulnerable during the long flight through confined terrain. "Phoenix, I'm seeing movement at the canyon entrance. Looks like they're trying to position anti-aircraft weapons to intercept our escape route." Phoenix made a tactical decision that would have seemed impossible to most pilots. Instead of attempting to escape through the canyon, she pulled the Apache into a steep climb, flying directly over the canyon walls at an altitude that would make her visible to every air defense system in the area. "Phoenix, what are you doing? We're completely exposed up here." "Ghost, they're expecting us to try to escape through the canyon. They're not expecting us to fly over it." For 30 seconds, the Apache was silhouetted against the morning sky, visible to anyone with anti-aircraft weapons and the training to use them. But Phoenix's calculation proved correct. Enemy forces had positioned their defenses to cover the canyon, not the airspace above it. By the time enemy fighters repositioned their weapons to engage the aircraft, Phoenix had already flown beyond their effective range. The decision to fly over the canyon rather than through it represented something that went beyond tactical innovation. It was the kind of thinking that came from understanding that unconventional problems required unconventional solutions. While enemy forces prepared for the escape they expected, Phoenix chose the escape they couldn't anticipate. "Control, this is Phoenix. Mission accomplished. 3 targets eliminated, aircraft intact, returning to base." The voice that came back through her communication system carried a mixture of relief and amazement. "Phoenix, Control. Outstanding work. Confirm all 3 targets destroyed." "Confirmed. Direct hits on all target buildings with confirmed eliminations." Flying away from the compound, Phoenix felt something that went beyond mission satisfaction. She had accomplished something that every aviation expert had declared impossible, using flight techniques that pushed both her aircraft and her skills to their absolute limits. But more than that, she had eliminated 3 of the most dangerous terrorist leaders in the region, potentially preventing dozens of future attacks and saving countless coalition lives. The flight back to base was routine compared to the mission itself, but Phoenix used the time to process what had just happened. She had navigated 15 kilometers of terrain that no rational person would attempt by helicopter. She had emerged from concealment at the perfect position for target engagement. She had eliminated 3 high-value targets simultaneously, and she had escaped from heavily defended airspace using tactics that had never been attempted before. But most importantly, she had proven that aircraft limitations were often limitations of imagination rather than limitations of technology. The phrase, "No Apache can hit that target," had been replaced by something else entirely. The understanding that impossible targets sometimes just required impossible flying. What does it feel like to prove everyone wrong in 30 seconds? Phoenix could feel the vibrations change as they descended toward base. The familiar rhythm of rotor blades cutting through air that meant home, safety, mission complete. But sitting in the pilot's seat of an aircraft that had just accomplished something every expert said was impossible, she felt something that went beyond relief or satisfaction. She felt vindicated. 8 years of being dismissed, overlooked, explained away. 8 years of having her expertise questioned not because of her flight hours or combat record, but because she carried it in a 5'7" frame with blonde hair and blue eyes. And now, in the space of 30 seconds over a fortified compound in the Tora Bora Mountains, she had proven that capability had nothing to do with appearance and everything to do with willingness to attempt what others called impossible. "Phoenix," Rivera's voice came through the intercom, "that canyon flying was absolutely insane. I've never seen anything like it." She thought about the moment they'd emerged from the canyon, the split second when months of planning either succeeded or failed based on her ability to transition from high-speed navigation to precision hover. The weight of that instant still sat in her chest, not pressure, but the memory of pressure released. Ghost, that was exactly what the mission required. Nothing more, nothing less. But even as she said it, Phoenix knew that what they'd accomplished was more than mission completion. They had demonstrated that conventional thinking about helicopter capabilities was limited by imagination rather than engineering. They had proven that the right pilot, in the right aircraft, with the right training, could accomplish things that existed in the space between design parameters and absolute limits. The base appeared ahead of them, familiar hangars and runways that looked different now. Phoenix had left that morning as an experienced pilot volunteering for an impossible mission. She was returning as someone who had redefined what was possible for military aviation. "Control, this is Phoenix requesting landing clearance." "Phoenix, you are cleared for immediate landing. Outstanding work out there." As Phoenix settled the Apache onto the landing pad, she could see a crowd gathering near the aircraft. Commander Thompson, Colonel Williams, and dozens of personnel who had been monitoring the mission from the command center. But more than that, she could see something in their faces that she'd never seen before. Not surprise at her competence, but recognition of what she had accomplished. She shut down the engines and began post-flight procedures, but her hands moved automatically through familiar sequences while her mind processed what had just changed. For 8 years, she had fought for respect in briefing rooms where her voice carried less weight than her appearance suggested it should. Now, stepping out of an aircraft that had just completed a mission everyone said was impossible, she realized that respect couldn't be demanded or argued into existence. It had to be demonstrated. Commander Thompson approached as she climbed out of the aircraft, his weathered face showing an expression Phoenix had never seen before. Not the careful professionalism of someone managing a female pilot, but the genuine admiration of one warrior for another. "Chief Anderson, that was the most incredible flying I've ever witnessed. You just proved that impossible targets really do just require impossible flying." Phoenix removed her helmet and shook out her blonde hair, feeling the weight of combat stress leaving her shoulders. "Sir, it was a team effort. Ghost's target acquisition and missile employment were flawless." Rivera emerged from the aircraft with a grin that extended from ear to ear. "Phoenix, that canyon flying was something I'll never forget. 15 kilometers of terrain that shouldn't be survivable for helicopter operations, and you made it look like a training exercise." Colonel Williams approached with an expression of amazement and respect that Phoenix had spent 8 years trying to earn. Chief Anderson, I owe you an apology. When you volunteered for this mission, I thought you were either overconfident or crazy. Now I realize you're just exceptionally skilled. Phoenix looked at the faces surrounding her, 30 men who had spent the morning watching a young woman accomplish something they had all agreed was impossible. But she also saw something else in their expressions. Not surprise at her competence, but recognition of what specialized training and willingness to attempt unconventional solutions could accomplish. Sir, I'm probably a little bit of both, but the mission required someone willing to attempt flight operations that nobody else would try. The mission debriefing revealed the full scope of what Phoenix had achieved. She had successfully navigated 15 kilometers of confined canyon terrain that aviation experts considered unsuitable for helicopter operations. She had emerged at the perfect position for target engagement. She had eliminated 3 high-value targets simultaneously, and she had escaped from heavily defended airspace using tactical innovations that had never been attempted before. But more than the tactical success, intelligence analysis confirmed the strategic impact. All 3 terrorist leaders had been killed in the missile strikes. The network they had been building was effectively decapitated. Their planned attacks against coalition forces were prevented, and intelligence analysts estimated that dozens of future attacks had been disrupted. Phoenix, Commander Thompson said during the formal debriefing, your mission today has probably saved more American lives than any single air strike in the past 5 years. Phoenix felt something settle in her chest that went beyond professional satisfaction. She thought about the soldiers whose names she had memorized, coalition forces killed by networks that these 3 men had built and funded. For the first time in 8 years, she felt like her skills had been used for something that justified the risk she had taken to develop them. Sir, I was just doing my job. Thompson's expression grew serious. No, you did much more than that. You found a way to accomplish a mission that everyone else said was impossible. That kind of tactical innovation is exactly what we need in this fight. Phoenix realized that something fundamental had changed in the way people were looking at her. Not as a female pilot who had surprised everyone with her competence, but as an exceptional pilot who happened to be female. The distinction mattered more than she had expected. She thought about the 18 soldiers who wouldn't have to attempt a ground assault with 60% casualty projections. About families who wouldn't receive folded flags because someone had found an alternative to acceptable losses. About the attacks that intelligence analysts said would have happened if these targets had escaped to continue their operations. Sir, the most important thing is that the mission succeeded without ground casualties. That was always the primary objective. But standing in the debriefing room, surrounded by officers who were looking at her with genuine respect for the first time in her career, Phoenix realized that she had accomplished something beyond mission objectives. She had proven that exceptional results came from exceptional thinking, not from meeting expectations that other people established. Rivera approached after the formal debriefing concluded. Phoenix, I need to ask you something. How long have you been planning that canyon approach? Phoenix considered the question, thinking about the weeks she had spent studying satellite imagery while everyone else dismissed the target as impossible. 3 weeks of intensive planning. But honestly, Ghost, I've been preparing for that kind of flying my entire career. What do you mean? Every confined space operation I've practiced, every precision navigation exercise I've completed, every emergency procedure I've mastered, it was all preparation for missions like this one. I just didn't know it until I saw that canyon in the satellite imagery. Rivera's expression grew thoughtful. So you're saying that impossible missions are just normal missions that require abnormal preparation? Phoenix felt something click into place, not just about this mission, but about her entire approach to military aviation. I'm saying that impossible and undiscovered aren't the same thing. Most limitations exist because no one has figured out how to overcome them yet. She thought about the computer simulation she had run, modeling flight paths through terrain that conventional wisdom said was unsuitable for aircraft operations. About the hours she had spent practicing confined space flying in similar terrain. About the tactical innovations that had emerged from willingness to question assumptions about what helicopters could accomplish. Ghost, the difference between impossible and difficult, is usually just the willingness to attempt solutions that other people haven't considered. Rivera nodded slowly. That's why they call you Phoenix. You don't just survive impossible situations, you find ways to make impossible situations survivable. Phoenix realized that her call sign had taken on new meaning. She wasn't just someone who rose from crashed aircraft anymore. She was someone who found ways to prevent crashes by discovering capabilities that existed beyond conventional parameters. But more than that, she had proven something to herself that went beyond aviation. She had demonstrated that expertise spoke with its own voice, regardless of the person carrying it. That competence created its own authority. That results mattered more than expectations. Standing on the flight line beside an aircraft that had just accomplished something everyone said was impossible, Phoenix felt something she hadn't expected. Not pride in proving people wrong, but satisfaction in proving what was possible when conventional thinking was abandoned, and someone was willing to explore the space between designed capabilities and absolute limits. She had spent 8 years fighting for recognition in a profession dominated by men who questioned her capabilities based on appearance rather than performance. Now, she realized that the fight had been worthwhile not because it proved she belonged, but because it prepared her for moments when belonging mattered less than capability. The mission was complete. 3 terrorist leaders were dead. 18 soldiers wouldn't have to attempt a ground assault with unacceptable casualty projections. And Phoenix Anderson had proven that impossible flying was the solution to impossible targets. But walking away from her aircraft, she realized that the most important thing she had proven was something else entirely. That limitations were often temporary conditions that existed until someone decided to discover what lay beyond them. How do you teach someone to fly through impossibility? 6 months later, Phoenix stood at the front of a classroom filled with 12 experienced Apache pilots who had volunteered to learn what they were calling Phoenix flying, the ability to operate attack helicopters in terrain and conditions that conventional wisdom said were impossible for rotary-wing aircraft. The students weren't novices. They were combat veterans with thousands of flight hours, experienced pilots who had survived multiple deployments, and understood the difference between calculated risk and reckless endangerment. But they had come to learn something that couldn't be taught through conventional flight instruction: how to discover capabilities that existed beyond normal operational parameters. The most important thing to understand, Phoenix began, addressing the room full of experienced pilots, is that impossible missions usually require abandoning conventional thinking. Every rule you've learned about helicopter operations was developed for normal situations. When you're facing abnormal situations, you need to be willing to develop abnormal solutions. She clicked to a satellite image that had become famous throughout military aviation circles, the canyon system she had navigated during Operation Desert Scimitar. The terrain looked even more impossible on the large classroom screen: geological formation that seemed to violate basic principles of aircraft operations. This mission succeeded because we stopped thinking about what helicopters couldn't do and started thinking about what this specific helicopter could do in these specific conditions. Captain Sarah Mitchell, a veteran Apache pilot with over 1,000 combat hours, raised her hand. "Ma'am, how do you calculate acceptable risk when you're attempting operations that have never been tried before?" Phoenix had been expecting this question. It went to the heart of military decision-making, the difference between innovation and suicide missions, between tactical creativity and reckless endangerment. Captain, acceptable risk is determined by what you're trying to accomplish. If those three terrorist leaders had escaped that meeting, they would have coordinated attacks that could have killed hundreds of coalition personnel. Risking one aircraft and two crew members to prevent that outcome was absolutely acceptable. She thought about Commander Thompson's words during mission authorization. These targets aren't worth losing an Apache and an experienced pilot. The calculation had been simple: 3 terrorist lives versus hundreds of potential coalition casualties. But the execution had required something that couldn't be calculated. But how do you know when you're crossing the line from acceptable risk to suicide mission? Another student asked. Phoenix considered the question, thinking about the moment she had entered that canyon, knowing that mechanical failure or navigational error would result in immediate death. Experience, training, and honest assessment of your capabilities. I knew I could fly through that canyon because I'd been practicing similar operations for years. I knew my aircraft could handle the mission because I understood its performance capabilities. I knew my weapons systems operator could make the shots because we'd trained together extensively. She clicked to the next slide, showing targeting data from the mission. But most importantly, I knew that if I didn't attempt the mission, those 3 targets would escape and continue killing American servicemen. That made the risk not just acceptable, but necessary. Captain Mitchell leaned forward. Ma'am, what's the difference between confidence and overconfidence when you're planning operations like this? The question hit Phoenix at a level that went beyond tactical considerations. She thought about the moment she had stood up in that briefing room, volunteering for a mission that 32 men had declared impossible. The fine line between expertise and arrogance, between innovation and self-destruction. Confidence is based on demonstrated capability. Overconfidence is based on assumed capability. I knew I could navigate that canyon because I'd practiced similar flying and run computer simulations of the specific route. I didn't assume I could handle it. I knew I could, based on measurable preparation and training. She moved to the front of the classroom, making eye contact with each student. The difference is preparation. Confident pilots prepare for missions they know they can complete. Overconfident pilots attempt missions they hope they can complete. That distinction can mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. Major David Chen, an experienced pilot with multiple deployments, asked the question Phoenix had been waiting for. Ma'am, how do you train for operations that exist beyond conventional parameters? Phoenix smiled, thinking about the hundreds of hours she had spent practicing confined space, flying in terrain that other pilots avoided. You start by questioning every assumption about what your aircraft can accomplish. Most helicopter limitations exist because no one has explored the boundaries of actual capability. She pulled up performance specifications for the Apache AH-64E. This aircraft was designed to operate in conditions that would challenge conventional helicopters. But most pilots never explore those capabilities because they're training for normal operations, not exceptional ones. The classroom was silent as students processed what Phoenix was suggesting: that aircraft limitations were often pilot limitations, that performance boundaries existed more in imagination than engineering. Major, you train for exceptional operations by practicing in progressively challenging conditions until exceptional becomes routine. You develop skills in controlled environments before applying them in combat situations. You build capabilities incrementally rather than attempting everything at once. She thought about her own training progression, years of gradually pushing boundaries until flying through narrow spaces felt natural rather than terrifying. But most importantly, you train with the understanding that someday, someone will depend on your ability to accomplish something that everyone else says is impossible. Captain Jennifer Rodriguez, a pilot with extensive special operations experience, raised her hand. "Ma'am, how do you maintain aircraft control in conditions that exist beyond normal flight parameters?" Phoenix had been hoping someone would ask about the technical aspects of extreme flying. "Captain, extreme conditions require fundamental changes in how you interact with aircraft controls. Normal flying relies on conscious decision-making and deliberate control inputs. Extreme flying requires muscle memory and instinctive responses." She demonstrated control techniques using a flight simulator interface connected to the classroom projection system. When you're navigating through confined space at high speed, you don't have time to think about control inputs. Your hands and feet have to respond to changing conditions faster than conscious thought can process information. The simulation showed the canyon approach from Operation Desert Scimitar, terrain that looked even more impossible when viewed from the pilot's perspective. Phoenix guided them through the critical decision points, explaining the split-second calculations that had determined mission success. "The key is understanding that your aircraft wants to fly safely. Your job is to guide it through conditions where safe flight requires constant adjustment. You're not fighting the aircraft. You're partnering with it to discover what's possible when both pilot and machine are operating at their optimal performance levels." She paused the simulation at the moment of target engagement. "But all of the flying skills in the world are useless if you can't complete the mission. Technical competence has to be matched by tactical effectiveness." Major Chen studied the targeting display. "Ma'am, how do you coordinate complex mission requirements when you're operating at the edge of aircraft capabilities?" Phoenix thought about Rivera's performance during the mission, his ability to acquire and engage 3 targets while she focused on keeping them alive through impossible terrain. "Major, exceptional missions require exceptional teamwork. Every crew member has to understand not just their own responsibilities, but how their performance affects overall mission success." She clicked to communications transcripts from the mission. "Notice how minimal our radio communications were during the critical phases. When you're operating at the edge of capability, there's no time for lengthy discussions. Every crew member has to know exactly what's expected and execute their responsibilities with precision." The students were taking notes, but Phoenix could see something else in their expressions. The kind of focus that came from understanding that they were learning skills that might someday mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. "The most important thing to remember," she concluded, "is that exceptional operations require exceptional preparation. You can't develop these skills during combat missions. You have to build them through systematic training that gradually expands your understanding of what's possible." Captain Mitchell raised her hand again. "Ma'am, how do you maintain psychological stability when you're attempting operations that exist beyond normal safety margins?" The question touched on something that Phoenix rarely discussed: the mental challenges of flying at the edge of possible, the psychological pressure of making split-second decisions when failure meant immediate death. "Captain, psychological stability comes from preparation and purpose. If you've prepared properly, you know you can handle the technical challenges. If you understand the purpose, you know why the risks are justified." She thought about the faces of soldiers she had carried home, about families destroyed by networks that those 3 terrorist leaders had built and funded. But most importantly, you have to understand that some missions are worth the risks involved. When lives are hanging in the balance and conventional solutions have failed, someone has to be willing to attempt unconventional solutions. The training program that Phoenix developed became the standard for unconventional Apache operations throughout the military. Her techniques were adopted by special operations aviation units, and her mission planning methods were incorporated into the curriculum at flight schools worldwide. But for Phoenix, the most satisfying aspect of teaching wasn't the recognition or the influence on military doctrine. It was watching experienced pilots discover capabilities they hadn't known they possessed, seeing them develop confidence in their ability to accomplish missions that had seemed impossible before they understood the techniques required. Every pilot has an operational envelope, she would tell her students during graduation ceremonies. But that envelope is usually much larger than most people ever explore. The difference between good pilots and exceptional pilots is the willingness to discover what your aircraft can really do when the mission requires it. She would conclude every class the same way. Remember that every impossible mission you accomplish saves lives that would have been lost if you'd accepted that the mission was impossible. That's why we push the boundaries of what aircraft can do. Not for the challenge, but for the people who are counting on us to find a way when everyone else says there isn't one. 3 years after Operation Desert Scimitar, Phoenix was selected to lead the development of next-generation attack helicopter tactics for operations in complex terrain. Her research focused on using natural terrain features to provide concealment and tactical advantage for aircraft operating in heavily defended environments. Her work resulted in the publication of Terrain-Masked Aviation Operations, a tactical manual that became required reading for military pilots worldwide, and fundamentally changed how attack helicopters were employed in combat operations. But for Phoenix, the most significant outcome wasn't the manual or the recognition, or the influence on military aviation. It was the knowledge that the techniques she had developed were being used by pilots worldwide to accomplish missions that saved lives and protected soldiers who were counting on air support to bring them home safely. What legacy do you leave when you prove the impossible is just undiscovered? Phoenix stood on the observation deck of the Aviation Hall of Fame, looking down at the Apache helicopter that had carried her through the most important 15 minutes of her career. The aircraft sat in the place of honor, polished and maintained, with a small plaque that read, Operation Desert Scimitar, proving that impossible targets just require impossible flying. 5 years had passed since that morning when she had volunteered for a mission that every expert said couldn't be done. 5 years of recognition, promotion, influence, and training programs that had fundamentally changed how military aviation approached unconventional operations. But standing here now, Phoenix realized that the most important thing she had accomplished wasn't the mission itself. It was proving that limitations were often temporary conditions that existed until someone decided to discover what lay beyond them. The ceremony downstairs was in her honor. Distinguished Service Medal presentation, recognition for tactical innovations that had influenced military aviation worldwide, acknowledgement of the training programs that had produced a new generation of pilots capable of operating aircraft in conditions that conventional wisdom said were impossible. But Phoenix found herself thinking about something else entirely. She was thinking about the 18 soldiers who hadn't had to attempt a ground assault with 60% casualty projections, about the families who hadn't received folded flags because someone had found an alternative to acceptable losses, about the attacks that intelligence analysts said would have happened if those 3 terrorist leaders had escaped to continue their operations. Chief Warrant Officer Marcus Rivera approached from behind, his footsteps familiar after years of flying together in situations that tested the boundaries of aircraft and crew capabilities. Phoenix, they're ready for your speech downstairs. She turned to face him, seeing not just her former weapons systems operator, but someone who had shared the experience of discovering what was possible when conventional thinking was abandoned. Ghost, do you ever think about what would have happened if we hadn't volunteered for that mission? Rivera's expression grew thoughtful. I think about it all the time. Intelligence estimates suggested that those 3 leaders would have coordinated attacks that could have killed hundreds of coalition personnel. Every training mission we fly, every pilot we teach, it's all connected to preventing that outcome. Phoenix nodded, understanding what he meant. The mission itself had lasted 90 minutes, but its impact had rippled outward in ways that couldn't be measured or quantified. Tactical innovations that had influenced military doctrine, training programs that had produced pilots capable of accomplishing missions that previous generations would have considered impossible. Most importantly, a fundamental change in how military aviation approached the relationship between designed capabilities and actual performance. Ghost, what do you think is the most important thing we accomplished that day? Rivera considered the question, looking down at the aircraft that had carried them through terrain that no rational person would have attempted by helicopter. I think we proved that expertise creates its own authority, that results matter more than expectations, that someone willing to attempt solutions that other people haven't considered can accomplish things that change how everyone thinks about what's possible. Phoenix felt something settle in her chest that went beyond personal satisfaction. She thought about the students she had trained, the pilots who were now flying missions that used techniques she had developed, the tactical innovations that had emerged from willingness to question assumptions about aircraft limitations. But most importantly, Rivera continued, we proved that impossible and undiscovered aren't the same thing. Most limitations exist because no one has figured out how to overcome them yet. Phoenix thought about the phrase that had defined her career, "No Apache can hit that target." Those words had represented not just tactical limitations, but limitations of imagination. The assumption that if something hadn't been done before, it couldn't be done at all. Ghost, I think the most important thing we proved is that exceptional results require exceptional thinking. That innovation comes from willingness to explore the space between designed capabilities and absolute limits. She thought about the moment she had stood up in that briefing room, volunteering for a mission that 32 men had declared impossible. The quiet strength required to offer solutions when everyone else was explaining problems. The willingness to risk failure in order to discover what success might look like when conventional approaches had been exhausted. Phoenix, are you ready for this? Rivera asked, gesturing toward the ceremony downstairs. Phoenix looked one last time at the aircraft that had carried them through the most challenging flight of their careers. But she also thought about something else, the future missions that would be accomplished, using techniques that hadn't existed before someone decided to discover what helicopters could actually do when operated by pilots willing to push beyond conventional parameters. Ghost, I'm ready, but not because of what we accomplished 5 years ago. I'm ready because of what other people will accomplish using the capabilities we helped discover. They walked toward the ceremony together, but Phoenix found herself thinking about the students she had trained and the pilots who were still learning to operate aircraft in conditions that conventional wisdom said were impossible. She thought about the tactical manual that had become required reading for military pilots worldwide, and the influence that their mission had on military aviation doctrine. But most importantly, she thought about the fundamental change in how people approach the relationship between impossible and undiscovered. The understanding that aircraft capabilities were often broader than most pilots ever explored. The recognition that limitations were frequently temporary conditions that existed until someone decided to find ways around them. The ceremony was everything Phoenix had expected: formal recognition, speeches about tactical innovation, acknowledgement of the training programs that had influenced military aviation worldwide. But listening to the presentations, she realized that the most important legacy wasn't the awards or the recognition. The most important legacy was the understanding that impossible missions usually just required impossible thinking, that aircraft capabilities were often limited more by pilot imagination than engineering constraints, that someone willing to explore the space between design parameters and absolute limits could accomplish things that changed fundamental assumptions about what was possible. Chief Warrant Officer Anderson, the presenter announced, your mission on Operation Desert Scimitar demonstrated that tactical innovation combined with exceptional piloting skills could accomplish objectives that conventional approaches had declared impossible. Phoenix accepted the Distinguished Service Medal, but she was thinking about something else. The knowledge that exceptional results came from exceptional preparation, combined with willingness to attempt solutions that other people hadn't considered. The techniques you developed have influenced military aviation worldwide, training programs that have produced a new generation of pilots capable of operating aircraft in conditions previously considered unsuitable for rotary wing operations. Standing on the stage, holding an award that represented recognition for tactical innovation, Phoenix realized that the most satisfying aspect of her career wasn't the personal achievements or the professional recognition. It was the knowledge that the capabilities she had discovered were being used by pilots worldwide to accomplish missions that saved lives and protected soldiers who depended on air support to bring them home safely. Your legacy, the presenter concluded, is the understanding that impossible targets sometimes just require impossible flying, and that the difference between impossible and achievable is often just the willingness to discover what your aircraft can really do when the mission requires it. Phoenix thought about the phrase that had started everything: "No Apache can hit that target." Those words had represented not just tactical limitations, but limitations of thinking. The assumption that design parameters were absolute boundaries rather than starting points for discovery. But 5 years later, that phrase had been replaced by something else entirely: the understanding that impossible and undiscovered weren't the same thing, that aircraft capabilities were often broader than conventional wisdom suggested, that someone willing to explore the margins of possibility could accomplish things that fundamentally changed how everyone approached similar challenges. Walking off the stage, Phoenix realized that the most important thing she had accomplished wasn't proving that impossible missions could be completed. She had proven that impossible was usually just another way of saying that no one had figured out how to accomplish something yet. The ceremony concluded with a reception where Phoenix was approached by dozens of pilots who wanted to discuss tactical innovations, training techniques, and mission planning methods that pushed aircraft operations beyond conventional parameters. But she found herself most interested in conversations with young pilots who were just beginning to explore the possibilities that existed when conventional thinking was abandoned. "Ma'am," a young Apache pilot asked, "what advice would you give to someone who wants to develop the kind of flying skills that can accomplish missions other people say are impossible?" Phoenix thought about her answer, considering the years of training, preparation, and systematic skill development that had prepared her for that moment when mission requirements exceeded conventional capabilities. Start by questioning every assumption about what your aircraft can accomplish. Most limitations exist because no one has explored the boundaries of actual capability. Then prepare systematically, building skills incrementally until exceptional flying becomes routine rather than extraordinary. She paused, thinking about the most important lesson she had learned during her career. But most importantly, understand that exceptional missions require exceptional preparation. You can't develop these skills during combat operations. You have to build them through training that gradually expands your understanding of what's possible. The young pilot nodded, but Phoenix could see something else in his expression. The kind of focus that came from understanding that someday, someone might depend on his ability to accomplish something that everyone else said was impossible. "Remember," Phoenix concluded, "that every impossible mission you accomplish saves lives that would have been lost if you'd accepted that the mission was impossible. That's why we push the boundaries of what aircraft can do. Not for the challenge, but for the people who are counting on us to find a way when everyone else says there isn't one." Later that evening, Phoenix stood again on the observation deck, looking down at the aircraft that had carried her through terrain that no rational person would have attempted by helicopter. But she wasn't thinking about the past anymore. She was thinking about the future missions that would be accomplished using techniques that hadn't existed before someone decided to discover what helicopters could actually do when operated at the margins of possibility. She thought about the students she had trained who were now teaching other pilots to operate aircraft in conditions that conventional wisdom said were impossible. About the tactical innovations that continued to emerge from willingness to question assumptions about aircraft limitations. About the missions that were being accomplished because someone had proven that impossible and undiscovered weren't the same thing. Phoenix realized that the most important legacy she could leave wasn't the recognition or the awards or the influence on military doctrine. It was the understanding that limitations were often temporary conditions that existed until someone decided to find ways beyond them. That exceptional results required exceptional thinking. That impossible missions usually just required impossible preparation, combined with willingness to attempt solutions that other people hadn't considered. Because sometimes, when lives were hanging in the balance and conventional solutions had failed, impossible flying was exactly what the mission required. And sometimes, proving that impossible was just another word for undiscovered was the most important thing someone could accomplish in a lifetime of service. The words, "No Apache can hit that target," had been replaced by something else entirely. The understanding that Apache helicopters could accomplish missions that existed at the intersection of necessary and possible, when operated by pilots willing to discover what lay beyond conventional parameters. And that understanding, Phoenix realized, was worth everything she had risked to discover it. Because sometimes dignity didn't speak, it simply acted. And sometimes the most important thing you could prove was that the impossible was just waiting for someone brave enough to make it possible.